Imagine a world where power is not just held but bred, a dark lineage woven with gold, ambition, and ruthless strategy, where the fate of empires is decided not just on battlefields, but in the silent, invisible veins of wealth flowing beneath the surface of history. Wealth, cold, unyielding, eternal, was the lifeblood of empires, the secret pulse behind the rise and fall of civilizations. And at the heart of this truth lies the brutal wisdom of Niccolò Machiavelli, whose rules of power reveal a chilling psychology that still echoes through the corridors of modern power. From the dust of ancient kingdoms to the marble halls of Renaissance Italy, the story is the same. Wealth breeds power, power secures wealth, and empires bleed and die when their wealth fades. This is no simple tale of riches and greed. It is a dark dance of survival, deception, and control. Let us journey into this shadowed history, uncover the anatomy of empires, and explore how Machiavelli's cold, calculating philosophy unveils the ruthless psychology that made wealth the bloodline of empires. Look back to the earliest civilizations, the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and early Chinese dynasties. What was the foundation of their power? The Nile's fertile banks, the Tigris and Euphrates' rich silt, the vast reserves of precious metals and stones. These empires did not conquer by sheer force alone. Their control over wealth, from crops to gold, ensured loyalty, secured armies, and built monumental structures that whispered of their eternal dominion. Wealth was the invisible army marching behind every soldier's spear. Empires built on wealth created a hierarchy where the ruling class controlled the distribution of riches, creating dependency and obedience. Wealth became a tool of psychological domination. The rich lived in opulence, while the masses toiled under the illusion of protection and prosperity. This dependency was not accidental. It was a crafted mechanism of control. In the Roman Empire, for example, grain distributions were not acts of charity. They were political weapons, binding the populace to the emperor's will. Yet wealth alone was fragile without strategy. Empires rose and fell on the ability of their rulers to wield wealth like a scalpel, cutting away threats and sowing loyalty with gold. Here is where Machiavelli's dark genius pierces through history. Machiavelli understood power not as a noble ideal, but as a ruthless necessity. His rule was simple. To maintain control, rulers must master the art of manipulation, using wealth as a tool to create fear, loyalty, and dependence. In his famous work, The Prince, Machiavelli does not romanticize power. He exposes its brutal core. He advises rulers to be feared rather than loved, to use cruelty if it secures their reign, and above all, to never appear weak. But wealth, Machiavelli argued, is the cornerstone of these strategies. It funds armies that crush rebellion, bribes allies to remain loyal, and creates a spectacle of power that commands respect. Without the bloodline of wealth, even the strongest prince is vulnerable to the knife of betrayal. History provides brutal examples of this truth. The Medici family in Florence used their immense wealth not only to finance art, but to weave a web of political influence that made them the true rulers behind the facade of republics. Their wealth was the seed of their empire, grown with calculated generosity and ruthless suppression of rivals. Machiavelli himself served the Medici, learning firsthand how wealth shaped power. But why does wealth hold this power? Because it is a language understood by every human desire: security, status, fear, and greed. In the psychology of power, wealth becomes a weapon that manipulates these primal drives. Those who control wealth can control what people want, what they fear losing, and how they view their place in the world. This control is subtle but absolute, turning subjects into dependents, allies into puppets. Machiavelli's rule reveals a dark psychology. Power is maintained not by justice or virtue, but by control over perception. Wealth creates perception, a dazzling light that masks weakness and commands obedience. The prince who flaunts riches convinces his people of his strength, even when the cracks run deep beneath the surface. The illusion of wealth is often as potent as wealth itself, a shadow empire that defends the throne. But what happens when the bloodline of wealth is severed? Empires crumble, often with terrifying speed. The fall of Rome is a cautionary tale. Economic decline, corruption, and depletion of resources eroded the foundation of Roman power. Without wealth, the legions lost their loyalty, the Senate lost influence, and barbarian invasions became the hammer breaking the empire's bones. The empire did not fall because of external enemies alone. It fell because its internal bloodline of wealth was poisoned and drained. This pattern repeats through history. The Spanish Empire. Wealth from the Americas turned to dust as inflation, war, and corruption consumed their riches. The British Empire's wealth funded global dominance, but also seeded conflicts that eventually unraveled its control. The bloodline of wealth is not just about amassing riches, but preserving and managing it with a ruthless eye. Failure to do so invites collapse. Machiavelli's teachings warn us that empires are living organisms whose survival depends on the circulation of wealth. Like blood nourishing a body, wealth must flow through the veins of society, armies, markets, allies, to sustain the heart of power. Stagnation, corruption, or mismanagement starves the empire, leading to decay and death. In today's world, the echoes of this dark psychology still resonate. Modern superpowers guard their economic interest with military might, financial manipulation, and covert influence. The principles Machiavelli laid out centuries ago continue to shape global power, where wealth fuels not just armies but entire nations' destinies. The bloodline of wealth is now tangled in corporations, banks, and international markets, but its essence remains the same. So, what does this mean for us? The story of wealth as the bloodline of empires is a cautionary tale about power's true nature. It strips away the veneer of idealism and exposes the cold, unyielding mechanics beneath. Wealth is not merely money. It is influence, survival, and control. To understand empires is to understand this brutal truth. Machiavelli's rule teaches us that power does not thrive on virtue but on strategy, fear, and wealth's cold embrace. Empires are not built on ideals but on the ruthless management of resources, physical and psychological. The prince who masters this art commands not just armies but the very souls of his people. The true horror of wealth as the bloodline of empires is not just in its power to build, but its inevitable role in decay. Wealth is like fire. When controlled, it fuels growth and illumination. When left unchecked, it consumes and destroys everything in its path. The empires that forgot this truth paid a terrible price. Consider the Byzantine Empire, the last vestige of Roman glory. For centuries, it held onto its wealth, both material and cultural, like a dragon guarding a hoard. But as corruption seeped into its elite, wealth began to wither, not in abundance, but in its misuse. The once mighty empire became a fragile shell, its wealth hoarded by a few, while the masses starved. Machiavelli's rule would have been clear: a ruler who allows wealth to be hoarded without circulating it among the people, and the army invites rebellion and ruin. Yet Byzantine emperors often ignored this, believing their ancient bloodline was enough to preserve power. It wasn't. The empire fell, not with a roar, but a slow, suffocating strangulation. Machiavelli's lessons come alive in the story of wealth's circulation, or lack thereof. He understood that power is maintained through constant vigilance and ruthless adaptation. The prince must be a lion and a fox, strong enough to crush opposition, but cunning enough to avoid traps. Wealth is the fuel for both strength and cunning. Without it, even the mightiest ruler becomes vulnerable. The psychology behind this is chilling. Wealth creates a hierarchy of dependence where loyalty is bought, not earned. This creates a system where power depends on constant reinforcement. The people and soldiers do not serve because they believe in a cause, but because their survival and comfort depend on the prince's wealth. This creates a terrifying fragility. The bloodline of wealth must never be broken, or the entire structure collapses like a house of cards. In Renaissance Italy, city-states like Venice mastered this principle. Venice's power was built on mercantile wealth and naval supremacy. Its rulers understood that maintaining an empire required more than armies. It required wealth flowing through the coffers to sustain diplomacy, intelligence, and military might. Venice's doges, though not absolute monarchs, wielded their wealth with Machiavellian precision, balancing fear and favor among nobles and merchants. This delicate dance prolonged Venice's dominance for centuries, proving Machiavelli's rule that wealth is the lifeblood of power, but it must be wielded with cold calculation. The dark psychology of this dynamic is a mirror to modern power struggles. Today's oligarchs and political leaders understand, consciously or not, that wealth is the key to control. Campaigns are funded, loyalties bought, and reputations built on the foundation of financial influence. The shadow empire of wealth operates behind every headline, every policy, every war. Machiavelli's rule is not just history, it is a blueprint for the present. But Machiavelli's vision was not merely descriptive, it was prescriptive. He urged rulers to embrace the darker side of human nature, to maintain power. To wield wealth, not just as a symbol of status, but as a weapon of control and manipulation. His ruthless pragmatism exposes the myth that power can be virtuous. Instead, power is survival, often brutal and heartless. One of the darkest chapters of this reality is the use of wealth to corrupt institutions. Empires and rulers use money to bend laws, silence dissent, and undermine justice. The bloodline of wealth flows not just in gold, but in influence, in the shadows where deals are made and enemies bought off. This corrupting flow can choke an empire from within faster than any external invasion. The history of the Roman Republic's fall into empire offers a grim example. Wealthy elites amassed vast fortunes, manipulating politics and buying armies loyal not to Rome but to their own coffers. The Republic died, strangled by greed and corruption, paving the way for emperors who understood the brutal calculus of power and wealth. Julius Caesar, Augustus. They all ruled with the cold precision Machiavelli admired, using wealth to consolidate power, create public spectacles, and silence rivals. Yet, wealth also breeds paranoia. The prince who holds power by wealth alone lives in constant fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of being outspent, fear of losing his throne to a richer rival. Machiavelli understood this psychological torment. Power is a double-edged sword, with wealth both as shield and cage. The prince must always be vigilant, for wealth can buy enemies as easily as friends. This paranoia fuels Machiavelli's most unsettling advice: to be prepared for cruelty and deception. The prince must not hesitate to use wealth for treachery if it secures his reign. Mercy and generosity are virtues only when they serve power. Otherwise, they are weaknesses to be exploited. This cold calculus is what makes Machiavelli's rule timeless and terrifying. As empires expanded, the bloodline of wealth grew more complex. Colonial powers extracted unimaginable riches from subjugated lands, fueling European dominance for centuries. But these riches were not free. They were soaked in blood, exploitation, and suffering. Machiavelli's rule would interpret this as the harsh reality of empire. Power requires sacrifice and often cruelty. The wealth of colonies became the lifeblood of empires, but it also planted the seeds of rebellion and eventual collapse. The psychology of oppression and resistance is intertwined with wealth. The same bloodline that built empires also nourished their downfall. The Industrial Revolution shifted the nature of wealth, but not its power. Capitalism became the new engine of empire, with industrialists and financiers wielding unprecedented influence. Machiavelli's insights morph here into the modern oligarch's playbook. Wealth is power, and power must be protected at all costs. The bloodline of wealth runs through banks, factories, and stock markets, shaping nations and destinies. The dark psychology of greed, fear, and manipulation remains, now veiled in corporate boardrooms instead of royal courts. Machiavelli's rule challenges us to see beyond the surface of power. The glittering facades of palaces and skyscrapers conceal the cold mechanics of control. Wealth flowing unseen, binding people and nations in a web of dependence. This dark bloodline shapes history's course and humanity's fate. Picture the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, reigning over France with absolute authority. His palace at Versailles wasn't just a home, it was a monument to wealth wielded as a weapon. Every gilded hallway, every ornate garden was carefully designed to dazzle and intimidate. Here, wealth was not merely money, it was spectacle, power, and psychological warfare. Louis knew the truth Machiavelli laid bare centuries earlier. The ruler who commands wealth commands the narrative. By controlling the flow of riches and the display of power, Louis turned nobles into gilded captives, dependent on his favor to maintain their status. They lived in opulence, yes, but shackled by the king's wealth, unable to challenge his rule. The bloodline of wealth had become a chain, binding not just resources but the very will of the powerful. Yet beneath this glittering facade, the kingdom's wealth was draining away. Wars, lavish spending, and inequality sowed the seeds of decay. The peasants bore the burden while the court feasted, a toxic brew of wealth hoarded and wealth denied. Machiavelli's cold warning echoed, "When the bloodline of wealth is severed or hoarded selfishly, the empire begins to rot." Decades later, the French Revolution erupted, an uprising fueled by starvation and fury. The bloodline of wealth, once the king's greatest weapon, had become his undoing. Machiavelli's insights don't just reveal power's mechanics, they expose its dark heart, the unrelenting human psychology behind domination. Fear, greed, envy, loyalty, all emotions exploited and manipulated through wealth's endless flow. The ruler's challenge is to balance these volatile elements, using wealth as a scalpel to cut threats, as a balm to soothe allies, as a fire to ignite loyalty. The prince is both surgeon and arsonist, his tool, wealth. This brings us to the chilling story of the Mughal Empire, one of history's richest empires, ruled by emperors who hoarded unimaginable wealth. The Mughals controlled vast territories in India, their coffers filled with precious gems and spices coveted worldwide. Yet their downfall came not from outside invasion, but internal decay, a classic Machiavellian tragedy. The emperors indulged in excess, their wealth concentrated in the hands of a shrinking elite. Meanwhile, corruption spread through the bureaucracy, and regional governors grew too powerful. The empire's bloodline of wealth fractured, its flow slowed, and rebellion ignited. The British East India Company exploited this weakness, their wealth and military might flowing like a dark river to swallow the empire whole. Machiavelli's rule plays out in cold reality. Wealth must be managed, shared strategically, or it becomes poison. Machiavelli's dark psychology is perhaps most haunting in his view of human nature itself, a view that power is a game of illusions, where loyalty is fleeting and fear is the most reliable currency. Wealth fuels this fear. It's the shadow looming over every subject's shoulder. The prince who commands wealth commands not just resources, but the anxieties and hopes of millions. This psychological grip is fragile, though. A single crack, mismanagement, rebellion, scandal can shatter the illusion, and with it, the empire. Look at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, once a titan straddling Europe and Asia. For centuries, it thrived on controlling trade routes and vast resources. Yet, as Europe's economies shifted and internal corruption took hold, the empire's bloodline of wealth began to wither. Sultans grew isolated, their lavish courts blind to the crumbling foundations beneath. Machiavelli's rule warns that isolation from the people, hoarding wealth, and failing to adapt spell doom. The empire became a shadow of itself, a cautionary tale of wealth's double-edged nature, both the source of power and the seed of collapse. Machiavelli's rule is not just about wealth as gold and silver, but about control over resources of every kind: land, information, military strength, and most importantly, the human mind. Wealth is the key that unlocks these domains, and the prince who controls it rules the empire's destiny. But this control demands relentless vigilance and often ruthless cruelty. Mercy is a luxury only afforded by the weak. Modern parallels to Machiavelli's rule abound. The Cold War was fought not just with missiles but with wealth, economic aid, espionage funding, propaganda. Superpowers invested billions to maintain influence, buying loyalty and creating spheres of power. Today, the global economy is the new battlefield, where trade wars, sanctions, and financial manipulation are the weapons. The bloodline of wealth still pulses beneath the surface, shaping alliances and conflicts, just as Machiavelli predicted. Consider the psychological toll on rulers themselves. The constant pressure to maintain wealth's flow creates a paranoia Machiavelli warned about. History is filled with rulers undone by fear of losing power. Wealth becomes a cage, a glittering prison that isolates, breeds mistrust, and demands ever greater displays of control. The prince must become a master of deception, hiding weaknesses beneath a mask of strength funded by wealth. Even the most idealistic revolutions, born from cries of justice and equality, cannot escape the dark gravity of wealth. They rise promising to break the old bloodlines, but soon learn the brutal truth. Without control over wealth, power slips away. The revolutionaries must learn Machiavelli's rule quickly, or perish. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and countless others all demonstrate this tragic cycle. Wealth and power are intertwined in a dance of darkness. As we stand today, in a world shaped by vast inequalities and global empires of money, Machiavelli's lessons ring truer than ever. Wealth remains the bloodline of empires, whether ancient kingdoms, colonial powers, or modern nations. To understand power, we must understand wealth, not just as currency, but as the dark force that fuels ambition, controls minds, and decides the fate of millions. The bloodline of wealth is the unseen empire within every empire, the shadow ruling behind the throne. Machiavelli's rule unmasks this dark truth and forces us to confront the brutal psychology of power. It is a lesson both ancient and urgent, a warning that the empires who fail to master wealth's cold, ruthless flow are doomed to fall into the abyss. So ask yourself, who holds the wealth today? And how do they wield it? The answer will reveal the true nature of power in our world, just as Machiavelli understood centuries ago. The bloodline of wealth never dies. It only changes hands endlessly, shaping the fate of empires in the dark.